Ready to start the second session of the morning. Have your attention, please, for a moment. We're ready to start the second session. My name is Michael Rosenblatt. I'm the Chief Medical Officer at Flagship Pioneering, but for today, I'm the co-chair of the Galien Forum, and it's my pleasure to introduce the next panel. The next panel is entitled, Can Disruptive Innovation Positively Impact Healthcare Costs? And it's chaired by Lynne Zydowsky, who's the Chief Scientific Officer at Alexandria Realty Ventures and Alexandria Summit. Lynne, I'm turning it over to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Mike. Thank you. We're honored to be here today at the Galien. And I'm just going to start with a few words and then introduce the panel. We'll go into what I hope will be a lively discussion. And if we have some time at the end, we may come out and ask the audience if they have any questions. So just to start, as Mike said, the title is Can Disruptive Innovation Positively Impact Healthcare Costs? And over the last decade, we have seen significant breakthroughs in science and technology, produce revolutionary new approaches, some of the world's most devastating and costly diseases. How we're fully realizing the promise of these groundbreaking advances to manage and cure disease, save lives, and significantly reduce the economic burden of disease on patients and society, it will require disruptive innovation across the entire healthcare ecosystem. So this panel today will discuss the critical opportunities and the complex challenges we face today in our effort to leverage innovation and positively impact patient outcomes on healthcare costs. We're not going to focus on drug pricing. You'll talk about that a little bit later in the day, but we will focus on innovation that can hopefully bend the curve with regards to healthcare costs. So today I'd like to introduce our esteemed guests. And our panelists, David Schenkein, David Epstein, and Josh Ofman, represent a wide range of experience from the intersection of life science and tech to biotech to big pharma to venture capital. These individuals have deep experience in policy and drug development. So to my left is David Schenkein, for those of you who don't know him. He is the general partner at Google Ventures. He is the executive chair and former CEO of Agios Pharmaceuticals. At GV, he co-leads the life science investment team. Previously, he spent 10 years as the CEO and a member of the board of directors at Agios, where he remains today the executive chairman. He has been a hematologist and medical oncologist for 30 years. He currently serves as an adjunct attending physician in hematology at Tufts Medical Center. And prior to joining Agios, he was the senior vice president of clinical hematology and oncology at Genentech. To his left is David Epstein, who is the executive partner at Flagship Pioneering. From the early 2010 to mid-2016, he served as the chief executive officer of Novartis Pharmaceuticals, a division of Novartis AG. Previously, he started and led Novartis's oncology and molecular diagnostic units, and under his leadership, the company's oncology business grew to the second largest in the world. He brings more than 25 years of extensive experience in drug development, deal-making, commercialization, and leadership on a global scale. And to his left is Josh Ofman, who is the Chief of Corporate Strategy and External Affairs at GRAIL. Previously, he spent more than 15 years at Amgen, where he most recently held the role of Senior Vice President of Global Health Policy, and prior to that, he was on faculty in the Department of Medicine and Health Services at UCLA. So with that, I'd like to start with our first question. I'm just going to go down the row, starting with David Schenkein. Just a couple of general questions so we can warm up. And my first one is, what excites you with the current and future disruptions in healthcare?
Well, first of all, thanks, Lynn, and thank you for the opportunity to be here today. To the organizers, it's always a special event. As a physician and a drug developer, it's incredible to see the changes we've seen in biology that have led to some amazing therapies. That's the purpose of the Galien Forum, is to acknowledge the new therapies and we'll have that award ceremony tonight. So it's been very exciting to see biology breaking open. I think the other thing, and the things we'll talk about on this panel today, for me, it's been really fascinating over the past decade or so to see several different fields which had been disparate before coming together in the spirit of better healthcare. And so biology and engineering have been coming together, and now certainly in my current world, seeing the merging of biology, healthcare, and the computational world come together. And I think as we merge these and remove any silos between these different fields of interest, we're going to see advances, and I know we'll talk about this today, across the board, not only from the therapies that actually get developed, the way we do clinical trials, the way we think about when and how we diagnose a patient with a variety of diseases, at what stage. I know Josh will talk a lot about this in cancer. And so I think it's an incredibly exciting time as not only the biology is opening up, but all the tools are opening up in other fields that are coming together. And I think that holds great promise for making the kind of impact in healthcare that will not only improve the lives of patients, but also lead to lower healthcare spending, which we'll talk about today.
Thank you. David Epstein?
So to the other David, that was very well said. I think you almost covered the universe there. Just a few things to add. The quantity of data we're generating now that we have a much better understanding of the human genome and its various products, the interactions, I think is going to open, and it is opening, a new door to using more intelligent design of medicines. People call it artificial intelligence, machine learning, and the like, which I think is going to allow us to make better medicines. I think likewise, the huge data sets we're creating through clinical trials, we'll be able to analyze those, what we've done right, what we've done wrong, and we'll be able to streamline the design of clinical trials going forward, which will hopefully take costs out of the system and lower the cost of making new medicines. And then at the same time, the door has been open to new modalities. When I grew up in this industry and my teams have developed and gotten approval for more than 30 drugs, we were largely working with chemicals and some simple proteins, and then it was really exciting. We went on to monoclonal antibodies, and that was a huge deal. I'm working with companies now that are genetically engineering red blood cells, using different aspects of the microbiome to make medications, putting crazy old things like amino acids together in new ratios. And of course, what's been a lot in the press, and I'm very excited about it, is really these one-time cures, the gene therapies that companies have been working on at great risk and now bringing to market. And we're making fatal diseases go away. I mean, this is tremendous. So it's a truly exciting time. I think we're all blessed, actually, to work in this field at this moment in time.
And Josh Ofman?
Thank you. And it's great to be here. So what's truly exciting to me is we've known for a long time that if we really want to bend the curve in total cost of healthcare in this country, we have got to transition our healthcare system away from a break it and fix it type of healthcare system and into a system that is focused on prediction, prevention, and early detection. And we've known that forever. But I think what you've just heard my colleagues say is we're at a very unique time where the convergence of a couple technologies are enabling us to see that future now. So just for an example, and I'll talk about this more when I talk about GRAIL, the convergence of human genomics combined with the reduced cost of sequencing, combined with all the advances in artificial intelligence and machine learning, brought together now are allowing us to see things we've never been able to see before. For example, even with just DNA, we're now seeing well beyond the coding variation, the script of the code of DNA. We're seeing beyond that now into how genes are regulated and how cells are directed, and being able to read much deeper signals to be able to predict disease and hopefully detect disease early. And so this convergence of these technological advances with this huge need in our healthcare system to make that transition, to me, is what is one of the most important opportunities we have right now, and it's an exciting time.
Thank you. And maybe we'll go just to another kind of general question, which comes to the heart of this discussion. And how do we leverage the disruptive innovation to impact the healthcare costs? So maybe just start the conversation as to different ways we can do that. David?
Yeah, sure. So there are two areas that I've been thinking a lot about lately, particularly in my current role. One is how do we use, as David mentioned, really our understanding and aggregation of large amounts of data to create more effective therapies. And there are two aspects of that. One is using that data to discover novel targets. And we've done this in oncology over the last 2 decades, where we have understood at a much more precise level that diseases are not just simply where they show up on an X-ray, but rather what is the molecular driver of that disease. We need to now push that out into other therapeutic areas, and that will allow us to develop much more effective therapies. And if they're more effective, they'll lower the overall cost burden to society. The other thing is a better understanding, as Josh said, as we look not only at the DNA of the disease tissue, but of the germline tissue, and really begin to understand polygenic risk scores and understand that not everybody is at the same risk of developing diseases. And that has 2 dramatic impacts that will affect healthcare costs. One is we don't need to screen potentially everybody at the same level. Some patients may need to be screened much less frequently, and others are at extraordinary high risk, even though they don't know it in their 20s, and need to be either screened differently, or the next topic, which I'm sure we'll talk about today, as David already mentioned, what if we had the ability to do a one-time treatment for those patients, whether it's a gene therapy or gene editing, and take away that risk? The other component is using those polygenic risk scores to change the way we do clinical trials. Clinical trials have largely been unchanged in the past 4 decades. And you imagine in the large killers like cardiovascular metabolic disease, if we could change the event rate in a clinical trial from 10% to 20% or 30% by looking at polygenic risk scores, we would drop the cost and time to conduct those trials dramatically. And that's already being done. And those, I think, will be incredible impacts on the healthcare system. I'll come back later and talk about some of the newer therapies. Particularly exciting, as David mentioned, are the curative therapies of potentially gene therapy or the new waves of gene editing technologies that we'll be able to offer patients over the next coming decade.
Yeah. I think what I'd like to add is if a lot of the innovation we've seen over the last 10 years, I participated in some of it, particularly in oncology, we were going after relatively small patient numbers. So people with relatively rare diseases, whether you call them orphan diseases or something else. The real bulk of the cost, of course, are the 80+% of patients, 85% of patients that have really chronic, debilitating, lifelong diseases, whether those be immune disorders, cardiac disease, diseases associated with fibrosis, Alzheimer's disease, and the like. And I think we need to now see a shift over time. Once our we get more confident about the long-term effects of some of these new technologies, that we can start to treat patients with more prevalent diseases. Now, the industry ran away from those more prevalent diseases because the bar for approval was higher, the large number of patients that were needed in clinical trials drove huge expenses. And I'll try not to be too negative here, but sometimes insurance companies would get in the way of making those drugs broadly available for those patients. So we've shifted to treating cancer and orphan diseases where it has been easier to get through the approval process, the reimbursement process, and the like. But to make a really big difference in this country and in the world, we're going to have to go after these more prevalent diseases. And I think you'll see companies trying. One of the companies, and I don't know much about what they're doing, but just reading headlines, you have the medicines company that's working on a twice a year therapy to bring down lipid costs. It'll be very interesting to see how that experiment plays out. Hopefully, they can do it at a cost level, and hopefully insurers will play ball to make sure patients can get drugs like this. Because at the end of the day, if we can't go to those more prevalent diseases, we're really not going to move the needle in a really big way.
So maybe we can just talk about a different disease and the opportunity there. I think if you're like me, many in the room have been touched by cancer. I personally have, in my family, been touched by a late diagnosis that was too late, an early diagnosis that resulted in a cure, and a scare of cancer. And nothing can keep people up at night like concerns about cancer. But the truth is, in this country today, we're losing 2,000 of our loved ones every day to cancer. And it's the #1 cause of life years lost. In other words, we're losing about 8.7 million years of lost life due to premature death from cancer every year in this country. And these numbers are just unacceptable. And the reason, why is this happening? The reason is because we are still detecting deadly cancers too late. Most cancers have no ability to undergo screening or early detection. And where we do, there are some imperfections, right? There's overdiagnosis. There are lots of false positives. They're inconvenient, they're invasive, and people aren't doing it. So we have a lot of work to do. And we know that survival drops dramatically when cancers are diagnosed late. And in the localized stage, 5 years survival is almost 90%. And it drops to almost 20% when the disease has metastasized into distant sites. So it's just a dramatic opportunity to find cancers earlier. So, I'm now with a company called GRAIL, and we're focused on building a company around this mission to save lives through early cancer detection. And what I mentioned earlier, this convergence of technology has now enabled GRAIL in this unprecedented time to develop a test that looks for DNA circulating in the blood. And we can identify through very small concentrations of circulating DNA from tumors where the cells are dying and releasing the DNA into the blood. We now have techniques and the power and the capability to identify those signals and discriminate signals that are coming from cancer versus signals that are not coming from cancer with very high accuracy. The key thing for an early detection test is what we call specificity, right? Specificity, you want a very low false positive rate. You don't want a lot of false alarms. Mammography, for an example, has a 10% false positive rate and is creating a lot of concerns about people undergoing workups that they may not need. PSA was a good example of a lot of false positives. The false positive rate from this type of technology, looking at cell-free DNA that GRAIL is doing, is below 1% now. And it can tell you what tissue it's coming from. Where is that cancer coming from? So a cancer signal is detected, it's coming from your kidney with very high accuracy, more than 90% accuracy. So this could be a potential game changer to be able to get a broad population to undergo early detection testing through a single blood test. And it really is one of the, as a public health oriented physician, look at the landscape and see where are the biggest opportunities for us to make a dramatic impact into public health. This looks to be one of them. So I'm very excited about this opportunity to kind of change the game around early detection in cancer.
And maybe just to stay with you a minute, Josh, I mean, obviously GRAIL, if we could go in and we could go to the doctor and we'd have a blood test and we'd have this panel looking at, all these different cancers, and they could say, Lynn, you have, stage 1 or stage half of 1, whatever, this kind of cancer. I mean, it really does change the paradigm. Maybe talk a little bit, though, too. It has to not only change the paradigm for us in terms of healthcare and survival, but the paradigm with the payers.
So, it's early days, but there are a few things we know. We know that late-stage cancer is very costly. In fact, diagnosis of cancer in the late stage can cost upwards of twice what it costs to treat early cancer, and it buys you very little health. You can extend survival late stage with late stage diagnosis a little bit. We're getting new and more innovative therapies that are doing better. But we know that we can buy an enormous amount of health when we make those investments in early detection. So if you can find cancers early, you can not only decrease the cost of treatment, but dramatically improve those outcomes. Additionally, because a test with less than 1% specificity doesn't have a lot of false positives, and I can give you some specific numbers, you do many fewer unnecessary workups. So the cost to diagnose a cancer goes down dramatically. So these are things we know that are easy to predict. Let me just give you a quick example. If you took all the people in America age 50 to 79 who were screening eligible and put them through the 4 cancer screening tests that we have in this country today, mammography, a fecal occult blood testing, or a Cologuard test, or a FIT test, or one of those tests, cervical cancer screening, and then a high-risk lung cancer screening, you might detect over 150,000 cancers. But you're going to produce 9 million false positive results.
Problem.
Okay? So the cost to diagnose a cancer is enormous. A test like the GRAIL test with less than 1% false positive rate could produce 3 times more cancer diagnoses and only add 1 million false positives to that. So the signal-to-noise ratio goes from what is about 60 to 1, right, or 1 to 60 signal-to-noise, to 1 to 2. Hugely different, a dramatic change in what could be the cost to detect a cancer. These are just projections using basic epidemiology and US population numbers. So I think there is a real opportunity to address the cost of cancer. You could also envision that what PBMs and health plans are worried about right now is their rising drug spend, the specialty drug spend. And my understanding last I looked was the specialty drug spend is about 30% cancer spending. And most of that's in late stages. So if you were to shift the stage of diagnosis earlier, could you bend that curve? It's unknown, but it's certainly possible.
Well, I mean, just to follow on that, as an oncologist, as you know, we've already demonstrated that in certain diseases. So if you go back to the development of Herceptin, which I worked on when I was at Genentech, when it first got approved in metastatic HER2-positive breast cancer, clearly had a positive impact, but it was pretty modest. But within a decade, we were able to bring it into the adjuvant setting, into women with early-stage HER2-positive breast cancer, which historically had the worst outcome. And using Herceptin in that setting, you improve the cure rate for those women by 50%. It's a dramatic difference in the outcome of the same therapy, whether it's given in late-stage cancer or in the newly diagnosed setting. So it's a perfect proof of principle, and we've known this for a long time, that if we move earlier in the spectrum of the disease, we're going to get a very different outcome for those women.
And maybe just to segue over, as we know, we now talk about cure, and that was something, that word even 10 years ago, we were kind of afraid to say it, but with all of the gene therapy and cell-based therapies, we do have that potential to really see the cure. Of course, in the news has been the Novartis drug for SMA, and even though I said I wasn't going to talk about drug pricing, we've seen, it costs $2 million, but it is a cost-effective, one-time, life-saving curative treatment that allows children with SMA to function, and something we thought that we would never see in that disease. I know, David, you talked a little bit about how the industry has shifted over to focus on the rare and orphan diseases, and maybe just take that a little bit further and a discussion too on other modalities.
Yeah. So first of all, just for a disclaimer, because I used to work at Novartis, I had nothing to do. I can't take any credit for their acquisition of Avexis, nor the approval of the drug, nor the pricing. Having said that, these are exactly the kinds of medicines we would love to have. It became fairly straightforward for them to price the drug in a way that it was cheaper than the alternative, because their competition, Biogen, had set a relatively high price for their SMA therapy that requires chronic use instead of just a one-time application. I do believe, once again, we're not talking about drug pricing, we probably can't live in a world that every single gene therapy costs $2 million per patient. The system won't allow for it, if for no other reason. Even if you save costs over time, the burden when each medicine comes up will really, I think, will shock the healthcare system in that given short period of time. So we need to get to the point where the volumes of these medicines go up, the costs of using these medicines can go down, and they become much more accessible to patients more broadly. In addition, there are modalities being worked on besides gene therapies, which may also be at a much lower cost. Some of the microbiome-related therapies, you may start seeing drug costs that are 5 to 10x lower than some of these costs. So I think this is a good start, and like any new technology, prices often start high, and they work their way down over time. You can look at what you paid. I'm getting old now. You can look at what you paid for your first VHS or DVD machine or whatever, and you see the price get cheaper over time. And I think that can happen here. What's important is there needs to be a way that they become broadly available. It's not just the price of the medicine. It's everything that then prohibits a patient from actually filling the prescription and using the medicine, whether it's a one-time drug or a drug that's used over time. And just to segue from gene therapy to something much more simple, and as I was listening to Josh, it just made me think about that. And this is really just from my heart to all of you in the room. If you exercise 3 to 4 times a week, if you get a reasonable amount of sleep, if you drink lots of water, if you eat reasonably well, get those trans fats out of your diet, you're gonna live longer. You're gonna have less disease. And can you imagine just a national effort to educate people how to take care of themselves and prevent disease, and then we can use your technology to early detect disease? The costs will come way down.
And I just to add one thing to that point, it's so important as a health economist. I mean, we are at a moment in time that's very precious. We are in an explosion of technological innovation right now. We're in an explosion of biomedical innovation, and when you're in times like that, looking at the unit costs and the unit prices is always a challenge because you tend to adopt a short-term fiscal focus. Mm-hmm. What you need to be thinking about in times like that is the price of health. What is it costing you to buy additional health? If you have a disease that has no available treatment, the cost to buy health is infinite. And so if you have something that is expensive to buy health in that particular disease, it is a lot less expensive than the alternative, and it may in fact even be very good value. So the social value is something that's really important. So for example, cancer, I'll use again as an example. A lot of people are dying of cancer. We can potentially keep a lot of those people alive. That is not going to save payers money, but it will provide an enormous amount of social value. In fact, the National Bureau of Economic Research has done analyses that suggest that just a 1% reduction in cancer mortality could yield $600 billion or more of social value. That means the productivity and the value associated with years of life. That's a very important thing to keep in mind, particularly when we're going through these periods of dramatic innovation.
I just want to pick up on a comment that David made, because I think it's really important to recognize that most of the advances we've done so far in the gene therapy space, and for full disclosure, I'm on the board of a gene therapy company, Bluebird Bio, have been in the very rare diseases like we see with SMA or thalassemia, sickle cell disease. And the results so far are early, but they seem pretty striking, and they do appear to be potentially curative in these rare diseases. I think the next frontier, again, using large data sets to be able to identify patients at high risk, can we imagine the time, and I certainly can, and we're beginning to invest in companies that are thinking of using these novel therapies, whether it's gene therapy or gene editing, in much larger, more prevalent diseases. So imagine that you can identify somebody in their 20s or 30s that, based on their genetics, is at an extraordinarily high risk over the next 20 years of developing a chronic, debilitating, life-threatening disease, and you have ability to give them at that age a safe and effective one-time therapy, either editing the genome or by a gene therapy approach that essentially eliminates that risk. And all of that downstream cost, and we know that compliance is a big issue with patients, and so it eliminates that whole thing. Now, we have a lot of work to do to show that those therapies are not only effective, but safe, that you're willing to give it in a prevalent disease We'll have to figure out the pricing model. But I think the impact on the healthcare cost and on patients' lives could be pretty tremendous.
And the beauty of the gene therapies and gene editing, once we're certain that we're not causing unintended consequences, is that you don't have to have a compliant patient anymore,
Exactly.
right? That's a beautiful thing.
Yeah.
Think about how much healthcare is wasted because patients either don't understand the directions that they're given, don't want at some emotional level to really treat their disease, go to the pharmacy and can't get a prescription filled because they can't afford the copay. But if you could bring them in, identify those most at risk, and get rid of that risk factor, whether it be through gene therapy or something else, they don't have to think about it again. You have 100% compliance. That's a beautiful thing. We'll save a tremendous amount of wasted resource.
So just to follow that up, approximately 50% of medications for chronic disease are not taken. 1 in 5 prescriptions, only 1 in 5 are filled. We could save $213 billion annually if medicines were used properly. Maybe just to throw out another question, there is this innovation in digital therapeutics and, the possibility of digital therapeutics to improve compliance, which obviously would have huge, as we've discussed, savings. Do any of you want to comment on that?
So I worked, and my teams actually, more to the point, worked on this when I was at Novartis. It was very clear that if you could increase compliance by even a small percentage, the outcomes for patients would be huge. We tried everything from apps to reminders to chips embedded in pills, chips embedded in inhalation devices, and I think there's something to be done there. My instinct, and I could well be wrong, and I'm not a digital guy, is that compared to some of the things that we've just talked about with gene therapies and gene editings and new modalities, the incremental gain there for certain diseases will be big, but across the board, I am not yet convinced we're going to change patient behavior in a sustainable way across enough patients that having an app is going to work long term. Doesn't mean for certain diseases it won't play a role, but I don't think it's I don't believe it's the magic wand. And I'm someone that's addicted to my device, so which is yet another problem. But that's just one man's opinion.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, I have heard about one of the most interesting apps that I've heard about recently is for diabetics who have continuous glucose monitoring, which is then attached to their phone and attached to their GPS, because we're all being tracked wherever we go. And so if your sugar is high and you're a diabetic and your GPS tells your provider that you're about to walk into Dunkin' Donuts, you get a text message that says, make sure you get coffee and not a donut, because your sugar is 215.
So, I like that one.
I think David's right that diabetes is a great example where digital technology is really helping patients in a dramatic way. But as you project forward for a moment and think about the demographic tidal wave that is coming our way in not just America, but in the European markets and Asia as well. And what that means is multiple comorbidities all at the same time. I think your ability to use digital technology to address that is much less. And so I think David Epstein's right on that there's going to be certain diseases where this is going to be dramatically helpful, but as you get into this demographic shift, it'll be less and less able to deal with the complexity, I think.
Where digital has started to play a role, and it's in the public domain, some of the large tech companies, Google being one of them, have looked at the ability to look at large quantities of data that are generated, for instance, in the first 24 hours of hospitalization, and being able to digest everything in the electronic medical record, including the handwritten notes by the nurses, and based on that, predict with a high degree of specificity who's likely to die in the next 30 days, who's likely to end up in an ICU, and that way you can begin to think about stratifying, intervening earlier, and decreasing hospitalization cost. So those kind of techniques, I think, are going to come out. I don't think we're ready yet for everybody to wearing apps or embedded chips.
No, I think you're right. Anything we can do to figure out in advance which patients need more intense care,
right,
and which ones don't, will bring down costs. And that sounds like one of a great example. And I have no doubt that digital technology works. I mean, they can apparently we can tell based upon Facebook posts who you're going to vote for. So this certainly should work.
Yeah, as physicians, we always used to be able to, some physicians were better than others, be able to see that patient in the emergency room and can't quite put your finger on what the problem is, but you know something bad is going to happen.
Yep.
We can look at that using machine learning and AI now to really be able to see what that was.
So I think it's a really important point, and I think we are in a different era of that now with machine learning and AI, but there are some cautionary tales out there. Let's just think about this for a minute from a policy perspective. Heart failure is a great example. We've known for a long time what are the factors in heart failure that predict early readmission. You know, they're basic things, you know, age, weight, medication compliance, ejection fraction, basic things that didn't take machine learning to tell us this person's at risk for a rehospitalization in the next 30 days. Well, Medicare passed a policy which reimbursed hospitals more if they prevented 30-day readmission. And guess what happened? Patients started dying at home. Okay? So we have to just be very thoughtful about how we do this. But I think with the new technologies available, the new insights we can glean, we have better data now, but it's all in the implementation, right? And how we do this the right way.
So this panel told me that they would take questions, and they thought that it would be fun to take questions from the audience. So I'm going to ask one more question of the panel, and then we're going to go out and take a few questions from you. So maybe just to come back and go a little bit deeper on clinical trials. I mean, as you pointed out, 85 to 90% of healthcare spending is due to chronic diseases. You know, those are the biggest, the hardest trials. We have shifted over to, you know, a bigger focus, it seems like, on orphan diseases and rare diseases. So, you know, all of you said in our prep calls, there is such a need for innovation in clinical trials. The cost of the trial, to make it more, you know, to raise the percent, there's that number, the 10 to 13% of all drugs that only make it from the beginning to the end. So maybe, David, I'll go to you.
Yeah, we've been spending a lot of time at GV looking at the clinical trial space because, as many of you know in the room and on the panel here, we've been doing clinical trials largely the same way for decades and decades. Incredibly inefficient, costly, collecting way too much data that no one ever looks at or doesn't even know how to interpret. And so we're beginning to see a whole series of startups and larger companies investing in really trying to turn the way we do clinical trials upside down and really take a lot of cost out. And we're seeing, I'm certainly seeing every aspect of clinical trials, people beginning to look at trying to change. Everything from the conventional way that a patient goes to see their doctor, the doctor says, you may be eligible for a clinical trial. What if we can go directly to the patient? Now, that's not going to work for advanced cancer, but that could work for cardiovascular disease, metabolic disorders, where patients could be enrolled not at their doctor's office, but could be enrolled at a pop-up store, or could be enrolled directly online and accessed that way, and streamlining the way we look at that. Collecting way less data, really understanding, working backwards from what data will the FDA or European regulators actually need to look at, and only collecting that data. Digitizing the protocols so that the nurse coordinator at the site is not putting little sticky notes in terms of what to collect on that day. It's all digitized and it's all really easy to collect. So every aspect is changing. I think one of the biggest impacts, as I mentioned before, particularly for the large diseases, the prevalent diseases, would be if we could really better identify who's at risk of having an event and get away from doing these massive trials where the event rate is 5 or 10%. And if you could double or triple that, it would take a huge amount of cost out of the system. So I think we're going to see in the next 5 years a big shift, not in every field, but in certain fields, a big change in the way we enroll and execute on our clinical trials, and hopefully make them more efficient, more accessible to patients, and pull a lot of cost out of the system.
Yeah, if I could just add one thing onto that. The FDA has been quite good, I think, working with the industry, particularly in oncology, to be more open-minded to accept novel biomarkers to help us then design our trials in a way that are more cost-effective. That has to move into other chronic diseases as well. Just to pick one that's more and more in the news now, there's a disease called NASH, fatty liver. It's associated, among other things, with obesity, people essentially eating too much, with diabetes and the like. And we're still living in a world where you have to do a liver biopsy in order to develop a NASH drug. It becomes incredibly prohibitive to do so. I don't have numbers in front of me, but I'd be willing to imagine that a large phase 3 clinical trial in NASH is going to, easily you could be spending $500 million to develop such a drug, and using a biopsy, which is a blunt instrument. I mean, for those of you who are not physicians in the room or healthcare professionals, when you do a biopsy, you're taking a very small sample and you're analyzing what the response was, as opposed to using digital technologies, MRIs, biomarker tests, looking at fibrotic markers or inflammatory markers in the blood, all things which we know correlate with good outcome. But we need to move the regulatory paradigm as well. Otherwise, these companies just simply won't be able to develop these drugs for people with these large prevalent chronic diseases.
I hold great hope for these advances in genomics. I think the blood-based approaches that we're using now to look beyond the code but into the genome and understand methylation patterns, for example. Maybe I can explain what those are just for a second. So, there are signals, or there are attachments to the DNA, methyl groups that attach, that basically tell your cells what to become. Should I become a brain cell or a liver cell early in development? And they also turn genes on and off. Those signals that we're seeing in cancer are the same types of signals we could be looking for in many, many other diseases. And so I think that to David's point, to predict events, to understand treatment response, who's likely to respond, to understand things without having to do imaging and tissue-based approaches, I hold great hope that these advances in human genomics are going to really help get to the place where I think you're saying we need to go.
Okay, so I'll just come out to the audience. Are there any questions? And if you have a question, I know it's a tight room, so I don't know if they can get a microphone to you, but stand up and say your name, your affiliation. Okay, we have two. We have one back here first, and then I'll take you, Dr. Vagelos.
Thank you so much, Lee Davies, and I am on the advisory council of the Hastings Center, the Bioethics Institute. So I have a bioethics question. You talked about gene editing in a person in his or her 20s. What would be the implications of accelerating that, perhaps screening newborns who are at risk and have a family history of a chronic disease, or even earlier in utero? This is something that the Hastings Center is focused on right now and grappling with. It's a very serious issue. There are cost implications, of course, and I'm curious about what you would see as the value for doing that.
Yeah, that's no question going to be a really important and tough issue as these therapies become available. Obviously, the bar, as you go younger in the patient, the bar for safety and long-term outcome is going to be higher and higher and higher. And I do agree with all the regulations and all the discussion ongoing now to make sure that we do anything in this space in a responsible manner. Obviously, not editing the genome in a way that can be passed on to the offspring, but rather just looking at the individual. And so, but I do think it's going to take a lot of long-term safety data before we're able to go down to the neonate. Now, again, it all depends on the risk in that child, because we are giving gene therapies now to children, and SMA is a perfect example, among other diseases, adrenal leukodystrophy, where we know these boys will all die by the time they're 10 years old. It's established. And so offering them either gene therapy or gene editing, I think as a newborn or soon after that is completely ethical, because they're all going to die. Yep. And so, but if you're starting to do that for someone with a risk of cardiovascular disease, it may not come up for another 30 years, that's a different story. Yep. It's going to take a lot longer and the bar is going to be a lot higher.
Yep. No, I think you said it well. I think you can come up with various forms of 2x2 matrices. We're looking at what the outcome is for these people, how long you can wait before you can intervene, and obviously those diseases which are slower to develop. I would want to get as much safety data over the next couple, even decades, before I was trying to alleviate something that is a long-term problem before I went into a child. I think we need to be cautious and understand that there's much we don't understand, and that we just simply can't predict. And so, but on the other hand, if you have only a few years of life, and that gene editing or gene therapy can make a difference, why not try it?
So Dr. Vagelos?
Yes. Yeah. I like the idea of detecting cancer early with a blood test. And I just wonder which cancers are now feasible and which are not.
So there are, obviously our test can detect well over 20 different cancers with a single blood draw. Which is pretty remarkable. One of the challenges with current screening is that it occurs one cancer at a time. So if you're an individual who has to undergo multiple different screening tests, each with a false positive rate that's relatively high, you could imagine what your own individual risk might be for having to undergo an unnecessary workup or to get an unnecessary scare. So the test that we're developing can test well over 20. It does, with good sensitivity and specificity, well over 99%. So there are about 12 cancers that we know account for almost 70% of mortality. That in those 12 cancers, the detection rates are even better. Yeah. And so I think there is a multi-cancer approach here, and there are other people looking at blood for single cancers. I know that in colon cancer, they're looking at the blood test for colon cancer screening, and they're looking at blood tests for many single cancer screening approaches as well. When you look in the blood, if you do it the way that GRAIL does it, by looking at methylation patterns, you see cancer signals for all the cancers. So by definition, it's really a multi-cancer approach.
Yeah, the other thing Dr. Vagelos just like to add, and I'm sure Joshua knows this too, while he's focused primarily on cancer, there are actually a multitude of what I would describe as relatively early stage firms now working on detecting disease earlier across many diseases, immune diseases, cardiac diseases, various forms of CNS diseases, using protein profiles, a bunch of other factors, and using various forms of AI to analyze that data. So I think we are only years away from actually seeing a number of those all of a sudden become available. And then the next question becomes, who's paying for the test? Because right now it's hard to figure out how someone would commercialize such a test, which is going to prevent disease. You know, who pays for something like that? And it needs to be discussed soon, because these companies are on the cusp, GRAIL being one, but there's others, bringing forward a whole series of tests that detect disease early. Some of them have claimed, I'm not part of any of these, so I can't validate their claims. They can find disease 6, 7, 8 years before you might see a clinical symptom. Who is going to pay for that?
Yes, over here.
Dr. Rose, I am the president and CEO of Vicro, which is a boutique regulatory consulting firm. Mm-hmm. And apropos to the statements that were brought up by all members of the panel regarding patient compliance and success, my question is, do you believe the bar for phase 3 trials on a device PMA is too high, because that is in fact done in a glass enclosure? Should there be more leniency to go into patient population earlier with more stringent phase 4 data collected?
I don't have as much experience on the device side.
I can't comment.
So it would be hard for me to give you a cogent answer there.
Yeah, I can tell you it's an area of great interest right now in policy circles and at the agency. They're talking about this quite a lot. There are new breakthrough designation categories at the FDA for devices and diagnostics, which shift some of the burden of evidence collection into the post-marketing arena to provide that kind of flexibility. But I think it's a very important discussion that's going on right now, actually, in policy circles about what that right balance is.
And that's what I'm worried about, the length of time it takes the agency make a decision.
Takes a while.
I've been in this field for over 30 years, and the only way we got early detection or early into patient population was AIDS activists.
Yeah.
And that was way back when they sat at the director of NIH's house and the FDA commissioner's house. And not that I approve of that means of getting movement. But, you know, we keep talking about it. And yet we have this vast number of drugs that should be successful that aren't given early enough. It takes a lot to get that early compassionate use. And what data are we...
Well, certainly on the therapeutic side, there's been obviously, ever since the AIDS epidemic and the use of accelerated approvals, on the drug side, that has had dramatic impact, I think, in the benefit of patients by approving drugs that have demonstrated efficacy based on a surrogate endpoint likely to predict an improvement in ultimate survival. And I think that has led to a host of important new therapies, more in oncology probably than in other therapeutic areas. And then those are followed up by definitive randomized clinical trials. And I think we'll continue to see that. I don't consider that a lowering of the bar. I think that's just changing, as David mentioned before, the endpoints that are highly likely to predict an important outcome for those patients. So I think we've seen a real improvement there, and I don't think that's a changing of the bar. It's just changing the way we think about getting these drugs to patients as quickly as possible once we've demonstrated adequate efficacy and safety.
But in this moment of incredible breakthrough innovation, particularly with genomic technologies, diagnostic technologies, there is going to be the need for some really careful policy discussion about how to ensure there is payment and coverage, in addition to the appropriate regulatory framework, whether it's allowing, PMAs versus LDTs and those kinds of things. And so getting that balance and that framework correct to continue to incentivize innovation, but mostly to be able to provide this new technology to the benefit of patients. And that does require some attention and work, and hopefully there are many organizations who are going to take that on.
Okay, I'm going to come over here.
Yes, Alan Harris from NYU Medical School. I have a comment and a question. My comment is that there has been, for the past several years, investigational work on the use of what is known as liquid biopsies to predict the response to therapy given to patients with neuroendocrine tumors that are really not rare diseases, they're really uncommon. And so this is a work in progress that's been going on in collaboration with Sloan Kettering here in New York. The second is a question, and that is, how does one deal with the lack of compatibility between the electronic records, because that's the world we live in. When you go and see your doctor, no matter where that doctor is she or he is part of a group, and that group basically has a system. But if you go from New York to Los Angeles or elsewhere, or even within New York, and you use Epic system or other systems, it's completely incompatible. So how are we actually? It's great. We have loads of data. The question is, how are we going to be able to collect the data in a systematic fashion, the same way that we've been doing with clinical trials? If data are not collected systematically, you can't evaluate them. And I'm concerned that in the digital world, we're going to end up with these problems.
I think Dr. Harris has pointed out something that we just failed to mention. Yeah, the electronic, the inability for different physicians and institutions and patients, for that matter, to share the same data set is a huge problem. Now, there are other parts of the world where it seems to work a bit better.
Yeah.
There's several European countries where these records, there's one platform. Sometimes they're archaic, sometimes they're not, but at least there's one set of data. And yeah, I think you're right. That would be one of the things that we should figure out a way to have one approach that, at least if nothing else, there would be interconnectivity.
Certainly, as David mentioned, if you and again, it's not perfect, but if you look at what the NHS is doing with a single EMR across the whole region, and then now being able to not only look at clinical data, but marry that with genomic data, we're seeing big advances there. In the US, what we've seen is people developing, and we've seen this in oncology with Flatiron or a few other companies that have gone and been able to scrape that data from disparate EMRs and put them together. But it is a major problem.
You're right.
You would have thought that the government would have come up with a single EMR for all of us to use.
So I mean, I'll use a real life example. So my dad, he's 84 years old or so. We were talking about this at dinner a little bit. Every time he's not feeling well, he goes to a different doctor. And he lives in Florida. He probably likes seeing the doctors. They have a nice conversation, and they order the same. They order the same tests. They have no idea. They take him off his all medicines, put him on new ones. He's on redundant drugs. There's got to be. My father has probably had more PET scans than certainly than the necessary, but compare that to someone who maybe is going for healthcare in the UK. There's a huge disparity, and it's not just because the UK is controlling healthcare costs. It's because my father is wasting healthcare and doesn't know any better. There's got to be a way to take costs out of the system. In fact, it's probably much bigger than I realized until you just asked the question and made me think about it. And if I could, just one other pet peeve of mine, so I'm taking the advantage of being the guy speaking, so you have to listen to me. One of the things in terms of healthcare costs, which is where we started the panel, if you get prescribed a drug, you want to actually, be able to get access to it, but you also want a drug that's going to work. I just finished reading a book. If you haven't read it and you're in the healthcare profession, you have to read this book. It's called Bottle of Lies. It's written by a woman named Catherine Eban. She's a reporter who has gone to great length to document among certain aspects of the generic industry the practices that go on. And it's very clear if even half of this book, even if 10% of this book is correct, that we as citizens of the world, including those in the US, are taking medicines that are subpotent. We're taking medicines that have no stability data. In fact, the stability data has been made up by the firms that's been submitted to the FDA. That these plants, these manufacturing plants, are inspected once, on average, outside the US, once every 6 years. And going back to my father analogy, now I realize my father would call me and say, my doctor tells me my blood pressure is out of control. It's been stable for years. And guess what? He changed to a different generic medicine. And, basically just a different manufacturer from a different plant. And the drug's not working anymore. This book documents where certain parts of the world, doctors routinely, when a patient comes in and loses control of their disease, whether it be epilepsy, their arthritic pains come back, their blood pressure is out of control, the doctors just double or triple the dose, expecting that the drugs are subpotent. I mean, this is horrific. What's the point of everything we do? You can tell I'm pretty emotional about this stuff. What's the point of all the money we spend if at the end of the day, the pill you're putting in your mouth is not what you think it is? And this needs to also be addressed.
So David made me read the book last weekend, and
We all bought the book.
I've just switched all my medicines to brand names. It's pretty frightening.
But maybe just one thought that was raised by the gentleman who asked the question about the electronic health record. I'll just make one point that I think people sometimes forget. If we just learn from our own history, the original claims data sets from Medicare and other payers were developed for claims administration. And we've tried to use those for clinical research and for clinical insights for decades and fail consistently. The current EMRs are being designed for physician entry and for reminders and alerts and for ease of use within systems and portability and things like that. We are now at the potential where we could have a huge opportunity cost if we don't get this right. The ability to do machine learning and AI now means that data need to be curated for machine learning. If you try to apply machine learning to data that are not curated for that intent, you will get a lot of noise, which is what's happening. And that's why organizations like Flatiron spent all that time and money to curate a very careful database just in cancer patients, but what about everybody else? So I just don't want anybody to have the misperception that just because we have a single EMR, that it would solve that problem. If it's not curated for learning,
Sure.
It's not going to be as helpful as we might hope.
So sadly, we're running out of time. But the panelists, I'm sure, will make themselves available. But I have one last question. This is your Twitter moment, hashtag
Oh,
Bring
no.
Galien.
Oh, no.
You know, since I have you all here and you all have so many years of experience in the industry, you know, my last question is, what do you think is the biggest challenge that's facing us today? And you can weave that into whether it has impact on healthcare costs or not. But I think it'd just be interesting to hear from all of you. So I'll start with you, David Schenkein.
Well, I'm an optimist, and so I'm incredibly optimistic about where healthcare sits right now and where it's going. And as I mentioned in the beginning, the intersection of the different areas is going to make a huge impact in patients' lives. I'm worried, and I know it'll dovetail into what others are going to say. I do worry about the differences in access to healthcare across the country and the globe, even today with things as simple as pills. And as we bring up all these new therapies we've been talking about here today, whether it's gene therapy, gene editing, novel pills, novel antibodies, how are we going to get those to the patients who need it and make sure that there aren't different classes of people who are able to access these medicines and afford these medicines? And so I think that's a big challenge.
Yeah. So it's hard to disagree that access is not the biggest challenge. And I'll just go back to something earlier I said. A big national movement to get people to exercise, to make sure our water's clean, to eat reasonably well, and prevent some of those diseases. So maybe access wouldn't be required. If we could do both of those things, I think we would have a huge step forward in, you know, the healthiness of the population.
That's a great point. My biggest concern, and I'm never one not to steal a good quote from a friend of mine, Dr. Mark Fendrick in the University of Michigan, we are in an era of Star Wars science and Flintstones healthcare delivery.
That's going to get quoted.
If we can't figure out how to change the coverage and payment rules and the delivery system itself so that we can focus on prediction, prevention, and early detection, very few of these technological innovations are going to make much of a difference.
So help me thank our distinguished panelists and thank you all for participating today.